So you're listening to the Press Rewind Prince Lyrics podcast, and on this episode, we'll be covering Ronnie Talk to Russia. Joining me to discuss this track is Zachary Hoskins. Hi, Zach.
Hey.
Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no problem. I think we've got an interesting song we're going to talk about today in Ronnie Talk to Russia. But before we get started on that, if you just wouldn't mind giving the listeners a background about yourself and maybe where they could find you and check out what you're doing.
Sure. So I'm a writer. I'm on hiatus from the freelancing, but I am a former freelance music writer who is now devoting all of my music writing time to a blog that is kind of, very much like your project, Jason, going through song by song from beginning to end, Prince's full catalog, or I'll either get to the end of the catalog or the end of my sanity, whichever comes first. So
I feel the same way sometimes as I go on this journey myself.
So right now I'm in 1999, the album, not the year, so not that much further ahead than this podcast. Mm-hmm. And if you guys, those of you listening, if I don't embarrass myself too much on the podcast, and you want to check me out, you can find the blog at princesongs.org.
All right, thanks. And as far as embarrassing yourself, it's mostly my fault because I keep inviting you to record songs with me that
That's
are
true.
Maybe a little atypical. So for anybody who hasn't heard Zach on the podcast yet, we covered Head and Sister together.
Yeah. That set a high bar, I think.
It absolutely did set a high bar.
In terms of what we're going to discuss, so.
Yeah. So with this song, though, we're not doing anything with a sexual background or anything that has explicit lyrics from a sexual standpoint. We've got a political song we're going to talk about today, Ronnie Talk to Russia. So this is the second track on side B, if you've got the LP or cassette, or the I think it's the fifth track overall. And it was also a B-side to Let's Work, which follows this song on the Controversy track listing. But it was a B-side, an interesting B-side. Like if I was, buying Let's Work as a, maybe somebody was kind of into Prince and just wanted to check out some of his singles, and I bought the Let's Work 45 back in 1981, and I flipped it over, and Ronnie Talk to Russia was the B-side. I'm like, what is this guy talking about? A lot of Cold War fears and
right.
Demands for peace, basically. So yeah, it's an interesting song from that standpoint. I think it's kind of an overlooked song on the track listing of Controversy. It's not one that is typically cited as being someone's favorite song from the album. I mean,
Definitely.
I really haven't heard too many people say that about this song.
Yeah. I know one person whose favorite song on the album is Annie Christian. I don't know if I want to put her on blast or not on the podcast, but I know zero people whose favorite song on Controversy is Ronnie Talk to Russia.
Yeah. That is not to say that the song doesn't have any value.
Right.
That it doesn't say anything, but the Controversy has got a lot of really strong songs, and many of them have something to say as well.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Controversy, Sexuality, those have a lot to say. Even Annie Christian, for that matter. And Private Joy, that's a really great dance song. Do Me Baby's an amazing, slow jam. And even Jack You Off is a really fun song. But Ronnie Talk to Russia, with its kind of, punky, rockabilly vibe, and kind of off-the-wall lyrics that, are a little dated, because inherently, if you mention the President of the United States in the name of your song,
right,
at some point it is going to become dated. It seems topical and relevant in 1981. He had just taken office. He was elected president in 1980, didn't take office, obviously, until January of that year. So he was a fairly new president, and he would be the president for the vast majority of the 1980s. So Prince was getting in on the ground floor and talking about Ronald Reagan in terms of, his presidency.
Yeah. And Ronnie did talk to Russia, and, the Berlin Wall came down later in the 80s. He was, we can say Prince was sort of ahead of his time in that way, I guess. But yeah, this is, I can definitely see, I mean, honestly, I'm even a little bit young to really fully grasp the, political resonances of this song. I was born in 84, right toward the beginning of Reagan's second term. Obviously was not very politically active at that time in my life. And I can only imagine, younger people today just hearing these references to Reagan and the Soviets and, the Sandinistas and being like, what is this about? It's a very early 80s song in every way, from, sonically to the politics.
Yeah. And the fact that Prince uses the name of the current president in the title, as I mentioned, instantly dates it, but he's not alone in that. I mean, there have been a number of musicians who have done something similar. I don't know how many. I mean, some of them have put the name of the politician that they're citing in the song right in the title. I mean, right. I know that there's a rapper from the 90s named Paris who really was railing against Bush Sr. In a song called Bush Killer. So, I mean, you can kind of get from the title of the song where he was leaning on that one. Yeah. Wasn't a big fan of President George Bush. And then Pearl Jam did something similar for Bush Jr. with a song called Bush Leaguer. So the Bush family, really wasn't popular amongst a lot of the musicians of the 90s and 2000s. Nevertheless, I mean, I'm trying to think of other ones off the top of my head. I know not an American leader, but the Beatles mentioned Chairman Mao in Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The actually for Reagan, the Ramones had a song called Bonzo Goes to Bitburg, which not Ronald Reagan, but he was in the Bedtime for Bonzo movies, so that was a direct reference to him.
Yeah, good call on that one. And there have been obviously other political musicians, Rage Against the Machine, Public Enemy, Ice Cube, et cetera. But I feel like with Prince and Reagan being such a new president at the time, Prince was probably, I can't guarantee this. I have no way to cite and promise this is fact, but Prince was probably one of the first to really mention Reagan in his song. There might have been some, punk rockers that mentioned him prior or something like that. I don't know, but pretty early on in his presidency. So yeah, I would say it's a fairly recent reference to President Reagan in 1981.
Yeah, and I mean for Prince, I'm sure you've talked about this. I haven't caught up on all of your controversy episodes yet, but I'm sure you've mentioned this. Controversy was, really kind of a new. It was a new thing for Prince too. I would venture that Dirty Mind is a political album in the sense that it is so kind of, aggressively toppling standards of decency and moral ideas and kind of representing that kind of like hedonistic viewpoints. It's political in the social sense, but controversy is when he really became like torn from the headlines, kind of political, and to mixed effects. I think it's in this case, I find a lot of Prince's more political music underrated. I think it tends not to be taken seriously for whatever reason. I think we've just kind of collectively made up our mind that Prince's takes on politics are not to be taken seriously, whereas someone like Bob Dylan, for example, we hang on every word that he might say about politics, or we used to. But I think that some of that is warranted and some of it is not. I think Prince did have some really interesting things to say politically. I think there are probably less of them on controversy than there are later in his career, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And with Ronnie Talk to Russia and later on in the track listing Anti-Christian, he makes an effort, but in many cases it's a little surface and there's not a lot of the message isn't as clear as you'd like it to be, and it's a little muddied. And even though you would think with a song called Ronnie Talk to Russia, because he tries to tackle a whole bunch of stuff in Anti-Christian.
Yeah.
Ronnie Talk to Russia feels like it should have like a very distinct and clear vision of what he's trying to the point he's trying to make. And with the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, the relationship devolving rapidly after Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan I think it was in 1979 they invaded Afghanistan, and the United States took a stand and like, well, we don't agree with that. And so we're going to boycott the Olympics. And basically Reagan had to, I mean Reagan wasn't the president at the time when that occurred. That was still Carter, but
right.
He had to follow suit because it was the way that we were moving towards really taking a stand against the Soviet Union and their attempts at invading neighboring countries and trying to take them over. The Cold War was just really starting to ramp up at that time as a result. I mean, we were not friends. We were a friendly country. We had fought together in World War II, but that was 30 plus years prior. So, things change fast in the political arenas and in global politics. So,
right.
Okay. Well, the song itself, I feel like it's kind of part of a suite of songs on side B.
Yeah.
That starts, of course, with the first song on side B, which is Private Joy. And then that song bleeds into Ronnie Talk to Russia from that really psychedelic kind of guitar solo that Prince inserts at the end of a very poppy dance song. It just the guitar solo at the end of Private Joy feels a little out of place.
Mm-hmm.
It moves there gradually, but the way the whole song goes, the strong structure of that track, then to throw that guitar solo, that's really kind of out there. And then that kind of goes into Ronnie Talk to Russia, and that's where this is like the next song in the suite that ends, I think, with Let's Work, really, because then there's a clear end with Let's Work before it moves into Anti-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And with this, then the music changes after the guitar noodling is done, and then you've got this really kind of fast synth line and these like drum machine hand claps that kind of stab into the synth line like exclamation points, I guess, or something along those lines. And then he begins singing the lyrics shortly after. I mean, this is a really short song. I didn't look up how long it is, but it's a short song. We know that. It's pretty, I think it's less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm seeing 1 minute 51. So yeah,
okay. So
and that's with all of the noise at the beginning, and it's got for a less than 2 minute song, it's got a pretty decently length intro. So
yes, it does. It does. You're right. And then once he starts singing, you don't really know. I mean, I guess if I'm looking at the lyrics online, it's the chorus is what he leads off with. Is Ronnie Talk to Russia before it's too late? And that is repeated later on, so it kind of feels like a chorus. And it also brings up the title of the song, so you can really make that argument that it is the chorus. So it starts off with Ronnie Talk to Russia before it's too late, before it's too late, before it's too late. Ronnie Talk to Russia before it's too late, before they blow up the world. So you right off the bat, you're getting Prince mentioning the title of the song and kind of explaining what Ronnie Talk to Russia means. And he's really trying to explain that he wants President Reagan to talk to Russia before, a nuclear attack or before some, this escalation with Afghanistan gets to the point where it becomes like another world war, for example, or something much more than what it was, where we were just condemning the act instead of like getting involved in yet. And I feel like Prince was really trying to say, this is getting out of hand. You need to talk to the Soviet Union. He says Russia, but it was still part of the Soviet Union at the time.
Mm.
Soviet Union doesn't really flow off the tongue quite as easily as Russia. So I can see why he used Russia as the country to speak of. Everybody knew what Russia was, and it's a lot easier to say.
Right.
So do you have any comments about that chorus? I mean, it's kind of straightforward.
Yeah, it's to the point. It's the way it's delivered, with the high pitched synthesizer that sounds like a Farfisa organ. It's got that kind of chintzy 60s garage rock kind of sound that was also, very in vogue with new wave groups. You can think of Blondie used it, Elvis Costello. those kinds of bands who we know that Prince was taking notes from at this point in his career. Just something about that, like that rah rah chorus and the organ and the hand claps, and it feels very goofy, intentionally so. I think, you know, this is a song that I'm constantly questioning how seriously I'm supposed to take it. And it goes back and forth, because I think, especially, you know, as the song progresses, it does seem like Prince is genuinely concerned about the sort of encroaching Soviet influence. And he is genuinely, you know, obviously he's preoccupied for much of the early 80s with this idea of nuclear holocaust, and, you know, more so around songs like 1999, but this is an emerging fear for him. But the way that it's presented is so sort of tongue in cheek that it's tough to tell, like, exactly how scared is he really? How scared does he want us to be? You know, how serious an appeal to President Reagan is this song? And it's you know, it's tough to say.
Yeah, I mean, you used the word goofy, and it really kind of is. I mean, if you're a hardcore punk fan and you're like, for example, I'm just going to throw the Clash out there. Let's say you're a big fan of the Clash and you like their politics, although they're not American politics necessarily, but
right,
political music and bands that are attempting to take a political stance through their music. And then you listen to this and you're thinking, oh, well, this is like B grade politics. You know, it's very up in your face what they're saying. There's no subtlety to it whatsoever. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes, you know, some artists don't want to be subtle, but Prince is not being subtle with this one at all. He's not alluding to anything. It's all very very overt and very upfront. It kind of adds a little bit to the charm of the song, but also a bit goofy, like you mentioned, just because it's the way it's kind of like a sing-songy, has a sing-songy approach to it. It's sung in a way where you can really, the lines repeat themselves often, so you like them like a chant. So those are types of techniques that I think a lot of these other bands haven't employed for their political songs up to this point. The way that it's sung and the way that the lyrics are written, it leads it to be a little more, it feels like it's a little slighter than maybe some of the other heavy political songs of the time.
Right.
Not a bad thing, just a comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so then after that there is a verse that goes, go to the zoo, but you can't feed gorillas. Can't feed gorillas, left-wing gorillas. You can go to the zoo, but you can't feed gorillas who want to blow up the world. So here we have a play on words again with gorilla instead of the primate. We've got the more the freedom fighter, or, you know, the combatant. And so he's talking about gorillas, and I'm guessing he's talking about left-wing gorillas who want to blow up the world. If I'm just thinking about the conflict in Soviet Union and Afghanistan at the time, I got to put the guerrillas must be the Afghanis, right?
It could be the Mujahideen. I read this as being the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which it's kind of funny. You mentioned the Clash before. The way that I found out about the Sandinistas is the Clash named an album after them.
Right.
And they were pretty unambiguously pro Sandinista. I think we can if this verse is about the Nicaraguan revolution, I think we can probably conclude that Prince is not pro Sandinista.
Right, because he calls them left-wing guerrillas.
Right.
I'll blow up the world. That's that's a strong statement. Strong statement that you have to assume that he's against the world blowing up, right? So I'm assuming that.
But it's sort of ironic, again, if in fact this is about the Sandinista revolution. in Nicaragua. It's ironic that he would bring it up in this song about Reagan, because as we know, like one of the huge controversies that later emerged in Reagan's presidency was his administration's sort of under the table support of the counter-revolutionaries in that particular conflict. And that was not really, at least, again, I'm not a Central American historian or a political historian. I could be wrong about this, but at least from my sort of middle of the road American perspective, Reagan's involvement in Contra was not a big topic of discussion in 1981. Like that seems to me was something that came out a couple of years later. So it's just sort of an interesting, it's interesting that it shows up here, because I don't know how purposeful Prince is being about it, but certainly in hindsight, it's like, wow, this is really getting at, some of the central sort of conflicts and issues of the Reagan years.
Yeah. But if it was just like a common statement about guerrilla warfare or, fighting back against oppressive governments and the use of guerrilla warfare style, typically though, you're not, well, at least in 1981, whenever I would think of, well, I wasn't thinking of it in 1981 because I was 6.
Yeah.
But when I think of guerrilla warfare, though, I don't think of like these massive dust-ups. I feel like they're more concentrated locally in towns or in communities, or, I guess they could be out in the country as well. But the whole blow up the world thing, I just don't see guerrilla warfare engaging in nuclear arms. I don't.
Right. Right.
It's just not something I think of too much. I just don't feel like they have that kind of resources to develop nuclear bombs. But
right.
So it's a little odd to me talking about left-wing guerrillas that want to blow up the world. Maybe it was more of a point, like they want to tear things down, they want to destroy, as opposed to literally blowing up the world. I don't know. All right, so then after that verse, we get to the, I guess, the bridge, and this is kind of a funny bridge. I don't know. I shouldn't laugh about it, but I mean, come on, it's whatever. Almost 40 years later, I can laugh about it. He says, "Ronnie, if you're dead, before I get to meet you, before I get to meet you, before I get to meet you. Ronnie, if you're dead, before I get to meet you, don't say I didn't warn you." And this one, I had to look it up because I needed to know the timing.
Right.
I mean, the timing where President Reagan was the attempted assassination of Reagan by John Hinckley, and the writing of this song. And so Hinckley shot Reagan in late March of 81, and all of any resources that I looked up to find out when this song was recorded were, like spring, summer of 81.
Right.
So I feel like this was probably written after.
Yeah, it would have been in the news if, in fact, assuming it was written after, it would have definitely been a big topic of discussion still when he wrote the song.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure.
And this is something I didn't catch until I wrote about it, because I always just heard it as like, if the nuclear war happens and you're dead, don't say I didn't warn you. And then, but when I thought about, because he also, I was thinking about Anti-Christian too, where he talks about, he sort of alludes to the Hinckley assassination attempt. And when I sort of put 2 and 2 together there, I was like, man, this is dark. Like, and so soon after the attempt on Reagan's life. Very, very interesting. If that's what he intended.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to make the assumption that he did, that it was written after the assassination attempt, and he was, kind of using the fact that, 2 to 3 months into his into his presidency, and he's already had an assassination attempt on his life.
Right.
And so he's like, well, maybe this is kind of going to be par for the course for his presidency, or get used to it, buddy, because if you're pissing people off, although Hinckley wasn't pissed off at Reagan at all, that wasn't the reason why he was even attempted to be killed. It had nothing to do with his politics or somebody disagreeing with what Reagan was doing as president or was going to do as president.
Right.
So, whatever. But, yeah, I think most people just automatically think that he's talking about, if the world doesn't blow up.
Right.
Before Prince gets to meet him, because of the whole Ronnie Talk to Russia is not about a song about assassination attempts due to wanting to impress young actresses. So
right.
I think the intent was probably talk about the Cold War and just the dangers that might be arising as a result of that. But it certainly is a statement about just being in the public eye and targets on the backs of people in the public eye as a result.
Yeah.
And Reagan was a target. He was already proven to be a target. Okay, so then we go to the chorus again. He just basically repeats the Ronnie Talk to Russia before it's too late, before it's too late, before it's too late. Ronnie Talk to Russia before it's too late, before they blow up the world. Don't you blow up my world. And I think they repeat that a few times. Don't you blow up my world. It's more like a kind of like a threat, or just a chanted threat. Say, hey, quit it. Make things right, because me and my generation want to live. We've got a lot of life to live, and don't fuck it up for us. By blowing up the world. Political leaders of 1981, and then you get the sound effect of the big explosion.
Yeah.
And that's how the song ends.
Yeah, I think this is one of the earlier Prince really, as we know, enjoyed putting sound effects on his, but I think he really didn't start with that until he was recording at Sunset Sound, because they had access to these, banks of these libraries of sound effects, and you hear it a lot more on 1999, the baby at the end of Delirious, and the traffic noises at the beginning of All the Critics Love You in New York, and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going on a limb here because I'm not 100% sure, but I think this might be his the first time he's dug into that sound effects library for an album. Yeah, I failed to mention, but there's additional sound effects that even precede the explosion. So after the bridge, when or like even towards the very end of the bridge, while he's singing the lines, Ronnie, if you're dead before I get to meet you, don't say I didn't warn you. And like right after that, you've got these pops of what's supposed to be like a gun, obviously. Oh, right. Yeah.
And they're loud, they're jarring. I mean, they're like really up in the mix. They're not in the back. They like overtake the entire song for those moments that, I mean, the music stops too, so the intention is to hear these gunshots, hear this machine gun fire, because all the music stops right during those gunshots. And not that you could hear music anyway, because like I said, they're loud and they're very upfront in the mix for that song.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got quite a few sound effects going on in this track, and I mean, it's a song that's speaking to Cold War fears. It's talking about potentially the Sandinistas. It's got some things going on, and he's kind of commenting on the fact that President Reagan was already shot and attempted assassination several months into his presidency. So violent sound effects are par for the course for this track. Maybe, I don't know if it's trying to scare the listener, but it's certainly its intent is to jar the listener, because at that point he's got Do Me Baby that leads into Private Joy, and then you go into this one, and it's a bit of a tone switch
right
from those two tracks to this for sure, but then it flips right back with Let's Work, because that's just a sexy dance song, really is.
Right. Right.
So yeah, any final thoughts on Ronnie Talk to Russia?
Well, just it brings to mind one of my favorite lines from a review of Controversy. I don't remember what the publication or the writer was, but this has just always stuck in my head when Controversy came out. They were, talking about the political content and the lyrics from Controversy, where he says, "Am I black or white? Am I straight or gay?" And the reviewer said he might as well also ask, "Am I always having sex, or do I sometimes watch CNN in bed?" And that is kind of that's the this song really kind of makes that, it always calls that quote to mind. It's a very interesting, it's an interesting track. It's sort of like this burgeoning political consciousness, maybe slightly confused because this is kind of a conservative, or certainly at least like a centrist song. And then, just a couple of tracks earlier on Sexuality, he was basically calling for organized revolution. So it, not the most consistent position from Prince at this period in his career. And it's also, I always think of Ronnie Talk to Russia as kind of like the first in a trilogy of Reagan songs. The second being Free from 1982, and then the third being America from 85. And those just seem like the three songs where Prince is expressing these, honestly very mainstream fears and anxieties about the Soviet Union and about the Cold War in a way that feels, sort of much more kind of conventional and middle American than you would necessarily expect from a guy who looks and performs like Prince. And it's very, very much, I think, in contrast to, I think Prince was taking cues from punk and new wave in terms of his sound at this time. In terms of his politics, though, he was definitely much more middle of the road than a lot of those punk groups that I think were, very unambiguously anti-Reagan at this point in time. And Prince is at best ambiguous about where he stands in terms of the Reagan administration and in terms of that whole. He's definitely, this isn't a left-wing song. It's maybe, I'm almost tempted to read it as a little bit of a right-wing song, but, at least it's very much, middle of the road.
Right. And it could partly be due to his upbringing in the Midwest.
Right.
Just reaching at this point for any clues as to why that might be. His Midwestern upbringing might have led to that, and just also his youth,
right.
And the fact that blowing up the world is bad.
Yeah, right.
Nobody wants the world to blow up, right?
Yeah.
I don't care how far right or far left you are, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you don't want everybody to die. So, that's a pretty safe stance to take.
Right. Yeah, and I think in that sense, it's consistent with some of his earlier political songs, like Party Up from Dirty Mind, which I think I tend to read in a much more left-wing way. But the consistency is that Prince wants the freedom to party, which is not certainly not a sort of mainstream Communist Party value. I'm sure there are some Marxist philosophers who are pro partying, but Lenin and Khrushchev and certainly Stalin, those guys did not know how to party. So I think, yeah, when you put it, when you think of it in those terms, there is a consistency, about from one of these political expressions to the other. I think personal freedoms was something that was very big on Prince's list of priorities at this point in his life.
Right, and any political song from this era would point to that, and probably you could find ways that would make sense and it would be agreeable to that statement, for sure. Also, spoiler alert, Ronnie does talk to Russia.
Right.
Russia does not blow up the world.
Yeah.
We're still here. It's 2019. We're still here. Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but Russia still does, and they didn't blow up the world.
Yeah.
So good job, Prince. Thanks for saving us. All right, Zach. I think that's probably going to be it for this one. I think we did our best.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's always fun.
So I want to say thanks again to Zachary Hoskins for joining me to talk about Ronnie Talks to Russia. It was an interesting conversation, I think. You should definitely check his stuff out at princesongs.org. So this has been the Press Rewind Prince Lyrics podcast. I've been your host, Jason Brenninger. Please contact me on the pressrewind.net blog or any of the social media platforms that I'm on. And until next time, thank you very much.